Today, we look at how often postpartum depression converts to bipolar and what that means for treatment.
Welcome to the Carlat Psychiatry podcast, keeping psychiatry honest since 2003.
I'm Chris Aiken, the editor-in-chief of the Carlat Psychiatry Report.
And I'm Kellie Newsome, a psychiatric NP and a dedicated reader of every issue.
Postpartum depression begins within 4 to 6 weeks of delivery. It's 4 weeks in DSM-5 and 6 weeks in ICD-11, and some argue for an even longer time span. But regardless of where we draw that line, we know that the onset peaks around 2 weeks after delivery. Until recently, postpartum depression was approached much like any other major depressive episode, typically managed with psychotherapy and antidepressants, with sertraline often the preferred one due to its relative safety for breastfeeding mothers. But two developments are changing that. First is the growing awareness that many cases of postpartum depression are due to bipolar disorder, where antidepressants would not be a good idea. If a woman is in her first episode of a depression, it is 3 times more likely to be a bipolar type if the episode comes on postpartum than if it comes on at other times. The other development that is challenging sertraline's dominance is zuranolone, Zurzuvae, a neurosteroid approved for postpartum depression that we covered last week. Today, I'm going to look at the bipolar piece. Zuranolone is not a treatment for bipolar depression, although Sage Therapeutics is exploring it there, but from everything we know about this drug, which imitates the neurohormone allopregnanolone and has GABAergic benzodiazepine-like effects, zuranolone is unlikely to trigger mania. And that is a meaningful advance, because if you give an SSRI like sertraline to a woman with postpartum depression, there's a good chance you might have the diagnosis wrong, and that SSRI may flip the depression into mania or mixed states. But just what is that chance? Some studies estimate that around 25% of women with postpartum depression have a bipolar diagnosis that hasn't revealed itself yet. Women who are hospitalized, have mixed features or psychotic features, or who have a family history of bipolar disorder are at greater risk. But the definition of bipolar disorder keeps changing, and some people, like David Kupfer, who edited the DSM-5, and myself, view this diagnosis as a spectrum where there is not a fine line separating unipolar depression from bipolar. When looked at through the spectrum lens, 40 to 50% of women with postpartum depression have strong bipolar features, if not actual DSM bipolar disorder. One large study of postpartum depression looked at it through both a spectrum and a traditional categorical lens. It was the International Bridge Study. In 2012, researchers compared 900 women in their first episode of depression. Some were postpartum and others were not. And here's what they discovered. From the categorical lens, using strict DSM-4 criteria, 15% of the postpartum women had bipolar, while only 5% of the other women did. Those numbers are similar to a larger longitudinal study that followed over 100,000 women in their first episode of depression for 15 years. It's a Danish registry study. And when followed for that long time, 14% in the postpartum group converted to bipolar compared to only 4% of the non-postpartum group. And that's using the strict DSM criteria, again, arriving at similar numbers to our bridge study. But back to this bridge study. After clarifying those strict DSM rates, the researchers looked at it through the spectrum lens. This includes true DSM bipolar disorder, as well as those with brief recurrent hypomanias and other markers of bipolarity. And this is important because these other markers do increase the risk of worsening on antidepressants. From this spectrum view, 40% of the postpartum women had bipolar, compared to 20% of the women who were not postpartum. And finally, the researchers looked at these rates through the lens of a rating scale, the Hypomanic Checklist 32. On that scale, 50% of the postpartum women screened positive for bipolar disorder compared to 38% of the other women. This wide range of numbers, from 15 to 50%, highlights the challenge of diagnosing bipolar, especially in the first episode when we don't have much history to guide us. The important thing is to acknowledge that uncertainty. Yes, the screening instrument is going to have false positives, and on the other hand, the strict DSM criteria will miss some women whose bipolar hasn't fully expressed itself yet. So I would keep an open mind as I follow the patient, because the truth is going to lie somewhere between that 15 and 50% figure. Now let's see what all that uncertainty means for zuranolone in practice. If you see a woman in the postpartum phase who's in her first episode of depression, you're going to need to treat her quickly, because a lot is at stake for her and the family with this. But that means you're going to be treating them with very limited information. And that is where zuranolone has a niche. Yes, I understand the criticism of this med, that it's just a 2-week course and it may not keep people out of depression. But on the other hand, its lack of prevention is balanced by its safety in bipolar during this vulnerable time when mood instability often crops up. We can't be sure what the diagnosis is during postpartum depression, but we also can't wait around to find out. We have to get them better quickly. Zuranolone checks all those boxes: rapid action, decent effect size, and no known risk of causing mania or mixity. It buys us some time. And yes, some women will relapse once they're off of it, but by that time we may have a better idea of whether they are closer to the bipolar or the unipolar side of the spectrum.
Let's pause for a preview of the CME quiz for this episode. Earn CME for each episode through the link in the show notes. What is the risk of bipolar disorder in women with postpartum depression? A. 15 to 25%. B. 5 to 20%. C. 50 to 70%. D. 15 to 50%.
Zuranolone treats postpartum depression by rebalancing neurohormones, but hormonal shifts are not the only cause here. Postpartum depression is an inflammatory state, and the anti-inflammatory drug celecoxib treated postpartum depression last year in a randomized controlled trial. The dose is 200 milligrams twice a day, and in that trial, celecoxib also increased BDNF and reduced inflammatory biomarkers. Circadian rhythms are also disrupted in the postpartum period, and evidence supports both morning light therapy and evening darkness to treat or prevent postpartum depression. In a small controlled trial, they had women wear blue light blocking glasses when they got up at night to feed the newborn, and you can find those glasses at chrisaikenmd.com/dark therapy. For women who undergo a cesarean section, using S-ketamine as the anesthetic might prevent postpartum depression, as it did in 12 controlled trials. Aerobic exercise and a healthy diet are also helpful for postpartum episodes, and psychotherapy is a critical part of the recovery, particularly when it promotes the mother-infant bonding and improves social supports. As a first step, bring the family in to improve understanding of the condition, reduce conflict, and problem-solve ways to increase social supports for the mother and share the caregiving burden among the family for taking care of the newborn. Simply providing the mother with an ergonomic infant carrier prevented postpartum depression in a randomized trial of low-income mothers. Next week, we're going to look at the psychological side of postpartum depression.
Want to keep up with the latest in psychiatric research? We post new studies in the daily psych feed. Search for Chris Aiken MD on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and that new one, Blue Sky. It's a first glimpse of the trials that inform this podcast. Thanks for tuning in and helping us stay free of industry support.